Welcome back to another Village Torah portion discussion with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. This week's Torah portion is Ekev. We are still very much in the book of Deuteronomy. And just as a reminder, this is filled with farewell addresses from Moses. And we get a lot of that in this week's Torah portion, chock full, actually, of very much Moses addressing the people, talking actually, it's funny because although I'm going to be talking about food and drinks, I think we all think about eating and drinking. I will have to admit that food and drink is actually not the primary focus or theme of this week's Torah portion. Perhaps if I had to describe a theme or at least a common expression, term, word to describe or to point out for this week's Torah portion, that would actually be remember, zachor, remember. And actually, a few times we encounter the reverse, which is forgetting, where Moses says, don't forget. I'll say, remember this, don't forget that. Remembering is very important to this week's Torah portion. It's a very common word that continually recurs throughout. However, I do want to point out the food aspect. Now, of course, we think about food, we think about eating, drinking, we think about meals and so forth. This is part of who we are as Jewish people. Actually, in fact, not only can we sort of anecdotally talk about it, yes, of course, we have a very common humorous phrase we often employ, which is our holidays often center around, certainly for Hanukkah, Purim, Passover, about they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat, right? That's a common, humorous way of describing our holidays, sort of how we operate. I also encountered the opposite here, which is on the screen, a funny little humorous comment from last month, which is food is one of the linchpins of Jewish society. That's why on fast days, you see Jews walking around looking so confused. They're like, what's the meaning of it all? What am I doing here? Nothing makes sense anymore. It's a time of real introspection. Now, clearly, this is humorous. This is a joke, and yet it reveals a lot of truth, which is so much of Jewish life is really built on eating and drinking. It's about food. So we're going to dive into some food and drink aspects that continually keep popping up throughout this week's Torah portion. And this actually, we see food and drink right off the bat in this week's Torah portion and the first couple of verses here. In Deuteronomy 7:12 through 13. And if you do obey these rules and observe them carefully, your God, the Lord, will maintain faithfully for you the covenant made on oath with your fathers. God will favor you and bless you and multiply you, blessing your issue from the womb and your produce from the soil, your new grain, your new wine, and your new oil, the calving of your herd, the lambing of your flock, and the land sworn to your fathers to be assigned to you. So this is part of the reward structure, which we're actually also going to see repeated at the end of this week's Torah portion. And then it continues. We see frequent occurrences about food popping up. This is clearly a reward that if we are to do these things, if we are to listen to God, to the instructions and part of this covenantal structure that the Jewish people have with God, we will be rewarded in a material sense. And we continue in other food and drink throughout this week's Torah portion. So here we see in verses 2 and 3 in the 8th chapter, remember the long way that your God, the Lord, has made you travel in the wilderness these past 40 years, in order to test you by hardships to learn what was in your hearts, whether you would keep the divine commandments or not. God subjected you to the hardship of hunger and then gave you man to eat, which neither you nor your ancestors had ever known, in order to teach you. So already I'm going to finish this sentence. I will complete the verse. I'm not going to leave you hanging, but we have hunger, which is counterbalanced by this man, the special provision that was provided to the Jews in the desert, the Israelites. Now, this is interesting, the way that Moses concludes this verse, in order to teach you. Here's the whole point, that a human being does not live on bread alone, it's not only about food, but that one may live on anything that the Lord decrees. So clearly, Moses is pointing out we think that humans need food to live, which is true, but there's also, okay, getting the base material aspects of living is important, but there's also this other piece about what literally the Hebrew is al komotza pi Adonai yichya ha'adam, that we live through what emerges from God's mouth. So there's this also this from the divine communication that really helps us, propels us forward, that yes, it's important to live with food, but it's also important to, whether for human beings in general or more specifically for us as B'nai Israel, as the Jewish people, that we need to have, this really propels us forward as a people, the word of God, that whatever emerges from the mouth of God. Okay. And just a few verses later, still in this 8th chapter, verses 6 through 10, therefore, V'shamarta et mitzvos Adonai Elohecha. Therefore, keep the commandments of the Lord your God. Walk in God's ways and show reverence. For your God, the Lord, is bringing you into a good land, a land with streams and springs and fountains issuing from plain and hill, a land of wheat and barley, of vines, figs, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat food without stint, where you will lack nothing. A land whose rocks are iron and from whose hills you can mine copper. When you have eaten your fill, give thanks to the Lord your God for the good land given to you. I will point out, of course, we're talking about these provisions, right? You need the good growing lands in order to get these grains, these other foods, but also I'm going to point out 2 other things here. We can always discuss them in more detail in the coming year, or next year, I should say. 2 things I want to point out that the rabbis, our sages, pick up on. The first is this aspect of a land of wheat and barley, of vines, figs, and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey. They take from this, of these species that are articulated in this verse, and they say this really presents us with a particular order of blessing, that when we are consuming any of these products, any of these agricultural products, that we are to bless in this order. So something, let's say wheat or barley, that would take precedence in order prior to us saying, let's say if we have a fig, before we eat that fig. Really interesting move on the rabbi's part. If it's earlier on, we would say it later when we are coming to eat, prior to consuming something. On the flip side, at the end of this, here, when you have eaten your fill, give thanks to your God. This actually, for those of you who might be familiar with the Birchat Hamazon, is actually towards the conclusion of the second blessing of the Birchat Hamazon, of the 4 blessings of the Birchat Hamazon, but also the sages understood from this that this actually generates the biblical command, the mitzvah that we actually learn from here. The sages derive from here for Birchat Hamazon, the mitzvah of blessing on the conclusion of a meal. So it's all really right here, not only in this week's Torah portion in a broader sense, but specifically all encompassed within this particular passage, that we have a helpful order for pre-consumption blessing, and then also the mitzvah that we derive in the post-consumption of a meal. So that's within this week's Torah portion. Okay, moving on, we have in chapter 9, verses 7 through 9, Zechor al tishkach. I mentioned at the outset, this is really, of course, I want to talk about food and drink, and you're probably also interested. Oh, food and drink. Yes, I am pointing out so many different appearances and occurrences of these. Actually, I learned a new word, victuals. I don't know if you have ever come across this word of victuals. It is not commonly spoken of, yet it is a term that can encompass both edible things and drinkable things, or comestibles and potables, as we might say, right? Things that can be eaten or drinking, comestibles and potables, but really wrapped up into one word, victuals. So really we can talk all day long about food and drink. victuals. But really, the star, so to speak, of this week's Torah portion is really right here at the outset. Zachor, remember, al tishkach, don't forget. That's the flip side of it. So it's right here. Remember, never forget how you provoked the Lord your God to anger in the wilderness. From the day that you left the land of Egypt until you reached this place, you have continued defiantly towards the Lord. At Horeb you so provoked the Lord that the Lord was angry enough with you to have destroyed you. I had ascended the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant that the Lord had made with you, and I stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights, eating no bread and drinking no water. And Moses returns to this, verses 17 through 19. Thereupon, this is a little bit later in his narrative, thereupon I gripped the two tablets and flung them away with both my hands, smashing them before your eyes. I threw myself down before the Lord, eating no bread, drinking no water, 40 days and 40 nights as before, because of the great wrong you had committed, doing what displeased and vexed me. For vexed the Lord. For I was in dread of the fierce anger against you, which moved the Lord to wipe you out. And at that time, too, the Lord gave heed to me. So here, Moses is talking about 40 days and 40 nights. But again, instead of drinking and eating, he's not drinking and not eating. It appears once more. And now we have in chapter 11, verses 8 through 12, keep therefore keep therefore all of the instruction that I enjoin upon you today, so that you may have the strength to enter and take possession of the land that you are about to cross into and possess, and that you may long endure upon the soil that the Lord swore to your fathers to assign to them and to their heirs, a land flowing with milk and honey. Eretz Savat Chalav Udvash. For the land that you are about to enter and possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you came. There the grain you sowed had to be watered by your own labors, like a vegetable garden. But the land you are about to cross into and possess, a land of hills and valleys, soaks up its water from the rains of heaven. It is a land which the Lord your God looks after, on which the Lord your God always keeps an eye from year's beginning to year's end. So here is an interesting contrast from the land from which they are coming, Egypt, to the land to which they are entering, Canaan. It's a different agricultural orientation, a different watering cycle. Okay. But ultimately, there's also the component of eating. We talk about Eretz Savat Chalav Udvash, a land flowing of milk and honey. We now come to the final mention of food and drink, final victuals mention, and actually it is at the end of this week's Torah portion. And I think the sages made sure that what was positioned at the very outset of this week's Torah portion in some way is reflected in a sort of concluding way here in the end of the Torah portion. It's a fancy term we might employ would be to say it's a lovely literary envelope, right? We finished off with the way we started, and it's going to sound very familiar. If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart and soul, I will grant the rain for your land in season, the early rain and the late. You shall gather in your new grain, your new wine, and your new oil. I will also provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and thus you shall eat your fill. Take care not to be lured away to serve other gods and bow to them, for the Lord's anger will flare up against you, shutting up the skies so that there will be no rain. The ground will not yield its produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord is assigning to you. Now, if this sounds familiar, that's because there's a few extra lines that I omitted here, but it's the second paragraph of the Shema. So we have 3 paragraphs of the Shema. The first 2 are both from the book of Deuteronomy, the third from the book of Numbers. And this middle paragraph is the only one that discusses victuals, the only one discusses food and wine. And so, of course, for those interested, 2 years ago, I discussed how this second paragraph of the Shema is different from the first, and its mention of a reward and punishment system operating off of the food and drink and sort of the whole agricultural piece and the rains and so forth. So I did discuss that. You're welcome to check that out. But it is really fascinating that it's a really lovely touch a lovely literary touch that it concludes in a very similar fashion to the way this Torah portion began, not only talking about the new grain, the new wine, the new oil, but also in this reward and punishment relationship, that if we are to behave, if we are to listen to God's commandments, we're going to be rewarded in an agricultural and material sense, and if not, we won't. So it works out actually quite nicely in that way. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation about sort of how we see food throughout this week's Torah portion. It doesn't seem so random or haphazard, even though I would say as I've described at the outset, the main common theme throughout this week's Torah portion really is about remembering and not forgetting. At the same time, it is quite frequent, as we have just experienced, to see victuals continually being featured in a certain way. Now, I'm not saying it's the most important part of this week's Torah portion, but food and drink are important to our lives. Of course, our lives as simply humans. Beyond that, as Jews, we love eating and drinking. We couldn't live without it, right? But we also have this aspect that we did mention. Of course, we have the piece from the second paragraph of the Shema, a common component of our liturgy. That's, it's not haphazard that it is there within our daily liturgy in the morning and the evening, but also we have what I mentioned in the middle about, well, two things. One, we have the piece about even just on a daily basis, our eating, and what the sages saw in that as helpful instruction as how we approach our before we eat and what type of blessings, and also when we finish eating, and understanding the mitzvah that is encompassed within this week's Torah portion to understand the Birkat Hamazon, to where this mitzvah originates, which is in this week's Torah portion. And one final thing, which is that it is not solely upon bread, not solely upon sustenance that people live, but also on what emerges from the mouth of the Lord. That we have this divine instruction, we have these mitzvot, we have this Torah. Yes, food is important for us to live, but also to elevate our experience of living and of life, that we have the Torah, that we have these instructions. So this is a lovely sort of a weaving together, if you will, of understanding where food is in all of this. Of course, we even had a mention of the manna, right? That came from the Lord, that came from God, but that's not everything. That we're also supposed to appreciate not just what it is, but where it came from. More specifically, it was provided by God. So that's something to be appreciated. And really, if we had to wrap it all up, I would say this really helps underscore our appreciation of food and drink, of these victuals, that it all really comes from God, from the Lord, and that it's wrapped up in our relationship with God. So there you have it. Food and drink, it exists, but we also experience it as a part of our relationship of the Jewish people and as Jews in our relationship with God. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this was insightful. You're probably, like me, also very hungry from hearing about food and drink. I know I'm thirsty. So with that, I want to say thank you so much. And before we go, I want to acknowledge that all Jewish in life and programming here at Majestic Care of Cedar Village are due to the support, the financial support of Jewish Home of Cincinnati. Thank you so much. And with that, I want to thank you again and want to wish you a Shabbat Shalom.